Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 18th chapter of the first book of Samuel. Herein we read of the biographical evolution of the new human protagonist, David, who burst onto the scene beginning in the 16th chapter. We read that he is the anointed. Saul, who was anointed as the king in the 9th or 10th chapter, has fallen out of favor with Yahweh, so his anointing for his disobedience, and because of that, he instructs Samuel to anoint another king, and he's directed by the divine will to travel to a town called Bethlehem in Judah, where he meets a man by the name of Jesse, who has 8 sons. He presents them in order of firstborn to last, and around the 3rd or 4th comes one of the highlights of that chapter, 16:7. Man looketh on the outer appearance, but Yahweh judges the heart. So the selection finally falls on the eighth born son of his, who is David. He's a shepherd and a musician and a warrior and a man of all trades, an all-around polymath who shows exceptional promise from his humble origins and his early youth. And so he's anointed, and almost instantly does providence arrange for the newly anointed to cross paths with the previously anointed. Saul, because he's in his wickedness, is visited by troubling spirits, and one of his servants recommends the services of David, who he knows is a talented musician and lovely singer, in the 18th verse of the 16th chapter. So from there on, Saul actually says that he loves him in the 20th verse or somewhere thereabouts in that chapter. And then in the 17th chapter, and Saul would be struggling with these demons, these evil sick spirits in him, and he would summon David, who would appear to the rescue with the harp or lyre in hand and sing his troubles away. Then in the 17th chapter, we read that he shows himself fully worthy of the anointing when the nation of Israel is engaged in a battle with the Philistines. These were pirates of Aegean origin who were repelled from invading Egypt by Ramses III, and so they kind of settled in what was to become the Promised Land. It had already been promised to Abraham since then, but they and a host of other people resided there by the time Joshua finally entered. But they had a literal giant by the name of Goliath, and one of the modes of ancient combat was to send a champion from one party to challenge the other champion of the other party. It was a one-on-one. It settled all disputes totally and finally, but no one wants to face this man who's 9 feet 9 tall. He's head and shoulders above everyone in the Israelite army, including Saul, who was selected, we read in the 10th chapter, or the 9th, that he was the tallest man in Israel. But even while all these grown men are quaking and fearing at the giant before them, David, who is 16 years old at this time, and virtually everyone in the Israelite army would have been head and shoulders above him, he faces this giant who's head and shoulders above them. He defeats him with a slingshot, and so then Saul kind of inquires as to where his whose son he is and where he comes from at this point. And then the 18th verse, or the 18th chapter rather, he answers the question. There's almost an instant flow, but this chapter does span a lot of range in the biographical years of David. So the opening verse reads, "And it came to pass, when he had ended speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own being." Jonathan was the son of Saul, and he was a promising prince who was victorious in military struggles. One of the lines I'll always remember is the line in the passage in 14:6, that the paraphrase principle is that the size of the army bears no relation on Yahweh's ability to defeat him. So he defeats a substantially larger army because he had faith in Yahweh. So he was a man of war, but also a man of faith, much like David. And the word love ought not to be interpreted as a homosexual relationship. There was no funny business in this relationship between the prince and the anointed. But this word also appears several times throughout this chapter, the Hebrew original. So David was universally beloved. He's beloved by his family, his son, his daughter, by the tribes of Judah and all of Israel, and even by Saul, we earlier read. So there is, just once more, there was no funny business between David and Jonathan or anything like that. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house anymore. So from this day forward and from this day on, he belongs to Saul. He lives in the palace, or he accompanies him wherever he goes. He is no longer under his father's supervision or jurisdiction. He is in the king's employ. And Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. Covenants were more formally treaties between governing the relations of a stronger party to a weaker party. It would have been familiar among the diplomatic lexicon of the ancient Near East, but the covenants that Israel had entered into was between Yahweh and man. So, and also covenant appears other times. One passage which comes to mind is when Job says, I have made a covenant with my eyes not to look on another woman in lust, somewhere in the book which bears his name. But this covenant is between two friends, two equals, two human beings. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, and his bow, and his girdle. Now, what he's symbolizing through these actions is that he accepts and recognizes that the anointing was on David. He had a claim to the throne. He was the king's son, but he was humble enough to recognize that the anointing was departing from his father and perhaps would not pass to him. It was Yahweh's will that this man after his own heart be raised to the throne. And Yahweh went out wherever Saul sent him, and he acted wisely, and Saul appointed him over the men of battle, and it was right in the eyes of all that people and also in the eyes of Saul's servants. So once more, wherever Saul goes, David goes. He's accompanying him first as his musical relief, his private musician, now sort of as his warrior, and he acted wisely in this capacity. He was entrusted to be a leader, a commander of men in the field, and there was no complaints. It was right in the eyes of all the people, and also in the eyes of Saul's servants, who eventually, we read, loved him. Saul no longer loves David as he once did. So from rescuing from the Israelite army from the embarrassment and the defeat of Goliath and the Philistines by connection, he kind of falls out of favor with the king. For the main reason is that he's threatened by him. He has the sense that the anointing is departing from him and perhaps has passed to this young man who in a lot of ways surpasses him in the popular acclaim of the nation he was king of. And it came to pass, as they came in, as David was returning from smiting the Philistines, that the woman came out from the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet Saul the king, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So while David was smiting the Philistines, that was their main enemy at this time. Interesting story, getting a little far ahead of ourselves, but David would ultimately flee to the Philistines for protection after things grew from bad to worse in this chapter between Saul and David. But the victories were usually accompanied by public celebrations, accompanied by music and festive occasions, and that's what we witness here. And the women sang as they danced and said, Saul smote his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So what should have been, they were ostensibly organized and gathered to meet Saul, the king of Israel, we read in the previous chapter, but here they're slighting him, offending him, and embarrassing him with this song which is chanted throughout the streets, which estimates David's greatness as exceedingly greater than his own, at least in terms as measured by the battlefield. And Saul was very wroth, and this matter was evil in his eyes. And he said, To David they have given 10,000s, and to me they have given thousands. So what more for him except the kingdom? So he recognizes, he perhaps exaggerates the dangerous potential of David, who never meant him any harm. He had a respect for the anointing, even if he could not respect the anointed. Two times he had Saul in his hands. He could have killed him, but he chose not to, because he had his faith and his confidence and his trust was in Yahweh above, to remove the one from whom the anointing had passed out of his way, in his own time, and through that vacancy he would eventually rise through the throne, and that's because Saul's sons were killed along with him. And from that day on, Saul eyed David. So this really marks a turning point in Saul's destructive energies directed towards David. From this day on, that means until the day he died, he always had this concern for David, who was usurping him in spirit, but not in fact, or usurping him in the public's imagination, but not in fact. He never meant to violently depose or any other way depose Saul. He had a respect for the anointing that the previously anointed did not. And it came to be on the next day that an evil spirit from Elohim came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house while David was playing by his hand as usual. And the spear was in the hands of Saul. So evil spirits, Saul is troubled by a lot of those, especially lately, and it goes from bad from worse here. And David was playing his music as was his custom, and it would have been in the vicinity of Saul. So Saul actually tries to kill him, because the spear that was in his hand, he eventually releases in David's direction, 11th verse. Then Saul hurled the spear, for he said, "Let me smite David even to the wall." But twice David withdrew from his presence. So he actually tried to kill him, and he made no ambiguity about his intentions with "let me smite him even to the wall." There's no mistake about his intentions, which so he verbally supplements the actions of his. It wasn't an accident. He didn't just randomly or arbitrarily pick up the spear and throw it in David's direction. He threw it because it was in David's direction, and this happened twice. And Saul was afraid of David because Yahweh was with him, but from Saul he had turned away. So Saul actually had a lot of potential and promise when he was first named king. He prophesied, he was visited and empowered by the Ruach Kadesh, which was rare amongst Old Testament saints, and but he took matters into his own hands. He couldn't be trusted to be the king while submitted to Yahweh. He was a self-serving creature, and as such was unqualified to be entrusted with the awful responsibility of shepherding and leading and protecting the covenant nation on earth. Saul therefore removed him from his presence and made him his commander over 1,000, and he went out and came before the people. So Paul's getting rid of him as a musician, but he's not getting rid of him entirely. He's appointing him to a commander over 1,000 troops, 1,000 men. And David was acting wisely in all his ways, and Yahweh was with him. So that's the second time we read that he was acting wisely. The earliest occasion is the 5th verse, but in a man of David's situation, his tenuous circumstance, where this king who's kind of entrusting him and appointing him and promoting him is also at the same time trying to kill him, to emerge unscathed and alive from such a predicament one cannot do in the absence of acting by wisdom and through wisdom, and one cannot hope to do it apart from the power and protection of Yahweh above, who was with him, in him, and working through him. And Saul saw that he was acting very wisely and was afraid of him. So even Saul is the wisdom with which he acts is tangible and visible even to Saul, and this increases the fear, which was earlier mentioned in the 12th verse, because he was acting wisely, so that only solidified his conviction that Yahweh was with him, and Saul was not acting wisely because Yahweh was no longer with him. But he was just wise enough to recognize the difference between him and David, and this causes him to increase in fear, and fear is a dangerous, irrational emotion which causes compulsive, uncalculated actions, and Saul's effectively setting himself up to be controlled by his own fears, his own irrational fears. But all Israel and Judah loved David as he went out and came in before them. So from the south to the north, the whole kingdom loved him. They acclaimed him. He was their guy. So away from Saul, he kind of had the security of the popular acclaim while he was in his presence or being hunted or chased down by him. He did not have the luxury, but for all intents and purpose here, he is recognized and acclaimed as the king of the nation from the south, Judah, and all the way to the north, Israel, in spirit, if not in fact. And Saul said to David, "See my older daughter Merab, I give her to you as a wife. Only be brave for me and fight the battles of Yahweh." For Saul thought, "Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." So with the closing sentence, we learn that the earliest sentence is an insincere ploy. The first thing is that he had already promised his daughter to the one who would smite Goliath. Now, the smiter happened to be 16 years old, which would have been, I think, a little early for the age of marriage in the ancient Jewish world. I could be wrong, but for whatever reason, he had not given him to her, and the cunning and subterfuge of his strategy is that he's not going to be the one to raise up his hand against him. Why not use my enemies to do what I would like to do but they can accomplish the deed, and not I cannot be tainted by raising my hand against my enemy in my midst. So according to Paul's strategic logic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Philistines would have known David as the boy who short years ago slew their mightiest warrior in an open battle. So they would have not loved David. We read that he is loved by Jonathan, by the younger daughter of Saul, of whom we'll soon meet, and he is loved by all of Israel and Jerusalem, and Judah, but the Philistines did not love him. And David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life or my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" So he's aware of he's from obscure stock and humble beginnings. He wasn't raised in royalty. He was raised in the sheep pen and risen from the pastures to the palace. But so he's questioning, he's acting humbly and modestly, that he considers himself unworthy to be married to the king of Israel, even though Saul came from similarly obscure background as referenced in the 9th or 10th chapter, where he considers himself the least of the least clans in the tribe of Benjamin. And it came to be at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Malonite, as a wife. So his oldest daughter was out of the picture because David had delayed. Saul didn't waste a moment giving this daughter who he had offered to David to someone else. But then we read in what's her name? Merab is not his only daughter. There's also one by the name of Michelle, who we're going to meet in the 20th verse, which reads, "And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the matter was right in his eyes." So he's loved not only by his son and his people, but also his very daughter. Now this love does not last. Eventually, she does play an instrumental role in his protection as his wife against her father's nefarious designs against David. But by the 6th chapter in the book of Samuel, we read that while David was dancing in jubilation publicly and in the streets in celebration of the Ark of the Covenant being safely returned to Jerusalem, his wife is embarrassed by it and perhaps embarrassed for him, and for that kind of signals the death of her love between him, and they would bear no children as a result. but she did play an instrumental role in gaining David's acceptance of his royal legitimacy to the tribes of the north, because they would have recognized the family connection. Saul's sons having died, it would have went to the daughter, and he, by connection of marriage, would have had a legitimate claim to the throne. And Saul said, "Let me give her to him, and let her be a snare to him, and the hand of Philistines be against him." So Saul said to David a second time, "Become my son-in-law today." Now, that "become my son-in-law today" sentence is also an insincere gimmick and ploy, because he's saying to himself, before he says this to David, that he's going to use the Philistines to do the dirty deed without dirtying his own hands or tarnishing his reputation as a result thereof. And Saul commanded his servants, "Speak to David gently, and say, 'See, the king has delighted in you, and all his servants have loved you, and now be the king's son-in-law.'" So he's instructing his servants to speak gently, the idea being to lull or persuade David into his traps and design. He's assuring him of the king, who had earlier twice tried to kill him with a spear for no greater crime than playing music in his midst, was assured that he delighted in him, and all his servants obviously did. But because the king is described as delighting in him, he wants to give him the honor of being his son-in-law. He's going to give him his daughter Mishael in marriage. And the servants of Saul spoke these words in the hearing of David. And David said, "Does it seem to you a small matter to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am a poor man and lightly esteemed?" So even though he's from modest backgrounds, he's actually being too modest in measure of his public acclaim and adulation. They have people dancing on the street. He's loved from Judah to Israel, from the north to the south, to the east to the west. And he's also, the chant that they were singing in the street was, "Saul killed his thousands, David killed his tens of thousands." Thereby he was greater in the public estimation at that point. But he's downplaying it and asking them, does it seem so small to you to be given such an honor, given the obscurity of your background and the poverty of your family? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, "David has spoken according to these words." So the same servants who would have been instructed and sent to relay the message return with his response and tell him. And how does Saul respond? Well, we read that in the 25th verse. "And Saul said, 'Say to David, the king has no delight in any payment for the bride, but 100 foreskin of the Philistines, to take vengeance on the king's enemies.' But Saul intended to have David fall by the hand of the Philistines." So Saul recognizes that he's not asking for a bridal dowry to be wedded to a king, to pay the king's daughter, and to pay the bridal dowry thereof would have been beyond the means of this humble son of Jesse from Bethlehem. But he's giving him another payment, which he intends and hopes to send him to his death, by giving him the foreskins of the uncircumcised Philistines. In order to do that, he's going to have to kill them. And the pretext is to take vengeance on the king's enemies. Now, they were Israel's enemies, but Saul was illicitly using them as allies in his nefarious scheme. And his intention is made plain in the sentence after the quotation marks. He intended David to fall by the hand of the Philistines, so he was going to have them do the dirty deed and remove the dirt from his own hands. And the servants declared these words to David, and it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. And the days had not expired. So David is immediately prompted to action. He's excited by the prospect of being the king's son-in-law, married to his daughter. And so he wastes no time in this challenge, as we read in the next verse. "And David arose and went, he and his men, and smote 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they put them before the king, to become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Mishael, his daughter, as a wife." So David not only accomplished the objective, but went above and beyond. He returned twofold with the minimum requested number of foreskins from the Philistine enemies. He went above and beyond the king's request and returned with him with 200. And we gather that not a whole lot of time was wasted in the pursuit of these foreskins. And so Saul has no choice but to give him Mishael, his daughter, as a wife. He's going to be an alive husband after all. He thought he would kill himself in the process of collecting these requested foreskins, or at least be killed by the Philistines rather, but he disappointed his traps and designs. And Saul saw and knew that Yahweh was with David, and Mishael, daughter of Saul, loved him. So everyone except Saul, everyone around him, seems to love this David. He's a lovable character because he is militarily mighty. He has the gentleness and the humility of presence, and he's really a sincere fellow in a way that Saul is not. And that's because Yahweh was with him. So there's a passage in Proverbs 16:7, when a man's ways please Yahweh, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. But Proverbs are principles, not promises, so that certainly isn't true. When Saul recognizes the presence and power of Yahweh basking and dwelling in David, he would have recognized it as something he once had and had since lost and squandered. So that would have provoked his wrath and envy, and only encouraged his conspiracy to get rid of him by any means necessary. So then Saul was still more afraid of David, and Saul came to be an enemy of David all the days. So David did not declare Saul an enemy. Saul declared himself an enemy of David. And David, we witness a beautiful Old Testament manifestation of the largely New Testament principle of loving one's enemies. Now, that principle is not entirely absent in the Old Testament. It's just expounded more fully on the New. But he did love his enemy. He did wish him no harm. He would bring no harm to him. And even though he responded with wrath, he would respond with forgiveness, and in so doing win over the servants and soldiers of Saul in the process thereof. And the princes of the Philistines went out, and it came to be, whenever they went out, that David acted more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name came to be very precious. So the word precious, I was anticipating it would read the name came to be very great, but precious is something altogether different, and I think rarer than a great name, to have your name and reputation. And in the Hebrew mindset, the name was indelibly attached to the character or nature of the person. But once more, David's acting wisely for the third time we read in this chapter, exceedingly more so than any or all of the servants of Saul. And he's doing his duty as Saul's servant in repelling the Philistines. He has a way of getting rid of them that no one else can, Saul himself included. So David is militarily mighty, and he is humble and every bit worthier for the throne than is Saul, and that is going to unfold over the course of the next 13 chapters. But that we witness, remember, David's only introduced on the 16th chapter, and already he's facing the giant and proving himself worthy of the anointing, but the problems don't really begin to set in until a little after this chapter. His anointing, his grasp on his anointing and the fulfillment of his promise seems tenuous at best at certain locations when he's fleeing from this envious, angry, and murderous sovereign, Saul. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.